D'accord, bienvenue à tous, and welcome again to our panel on immigration policy in Europe. I'll be moderating today, and again, if you just arrived, my name is Terry Givens. This is such an important topic, and we know from our discussion yesterday that there's a lot of interest in what's going on in Canada on the European side, but we need to have a better understanding what is going on in Europe. I talked about this, of course, earlier, but we have an amazing set of panelists who are joining us today, and I'd like to thank them in advance for being here to lend us their invaluable perspectives on this issue. And I will start with my colleague Antje Ellerman, who is a professor of political science and the founding director of the Center for Migration Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Her research focuses on the politics of migration and citizenship in liberal democracies. She is the author of The Comparative Politics of Immigration, Policy Choices in Germany, Canada, Switzerland, and the United States, and States Against Migrants, Deportation in Germany and the United States. Her work has also appeared in journals such as World Politics, Comparative Political Studies, Politics and Society, Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, West European Politics, Government and Opposition, and International Migration. And just want to mention that the University of British Columbia in Vancouver is on Musqueam territory. Our next panelist at the end is my colleague Justin Guest, who is Associate Professor of Policy and Government at George Mason University's Schar School of Public Policy and Government. He studies immigration and the politics of demographic change. He is the author of 6 books, Apart, Alienated, and Engaged Muslims in the West, The New Minority, White Working Class Politics in an Age of Immigration and Inequality, The White Working Class, What Everyone Needs to Know, and Crossroads, Comparative Immigration Regimes in a World of Demographic Change. 2 of his more recent books include Mass Appeal, Communicating Policy Ideas in Multiple Media, and coming out this year is Majority Minority. He also co-edits the Oxford University Press book series, Oxford Studies in Migration and Citizenship. Next, we have Anna Korteweg, who is the professor of sociology at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on immigrant integration as a politics of non-belonging. Her current projects look at the return of women and men who joined ISIS to their European home countries, the construction of borders and subjectivity in LGBTQ+ refugee politics, and the citizenship implications of refugee sponsorship in Canada. She has published 2 monographs, The Headscarf Debates, Conflicts of National Belonging, the Debating Sharia, Islam, Gender Politics, and Family Law Arbitration, as well as numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. And last but not least, we have Phil, and I'm going to do my best to pronounce it right, Phil Triadopoulos, is that right? Woohoo! Associate Professor of Political Science at the, I just call him Phil, it makes it a lot easier. But he's the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. He teaches courses in political science and public policy at the University of Toronto Scarborough and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He conducts research in the areas of immigration and citizenship policy in Europe and North America. He received his PhD in political science for the New School for Social Research and is a former Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada postdoctoral fellow. He is the author of Becoming Multicultural, Immigration and the Politics of Membership in Canada and Germany, the editor of Wanted and Welcome, Policies for Highly Skilled Immigrants and Comparative Perspective, and the co-editor of Segmented Cities, How Urban Contexts Shape Ethnic and Nationalist Policies, or Politics rather. So, a very distinguished panel, and I want to start with a very broad question, and I hope each of you will approach it in your own way. But the first question, how has immigration policy developed or shifted across Europe in the last 20 years? And I'm going to pick on Phil first.
Sure. Thanks, Terry. I think what we've seen is a move away from restricting migration outright to managing migration so that it can be harnessed to meet labor market needs. So West European countries have rejected a zero migration baseline, which was the norm as late as the early 1990s, and taken up managed migration instead. So this trend has its roots in the 1990s and early 2000s. You see it in the decisions of Tony Blair and New Labour in Britain. You see it in the Green Card Initiative and other steps taken by the SPD Green Coalition government of Chancellor Schroeder. And you see it in what you mentioned in your keynote, the role of the EU beginning in that period. And it's so left of center parties initiate, but really the move is entrenched by right of center parties, and most obviously in Germany under Angela Merkel's chancellorship during a grand coalition that joined the SPD and the CDU, CSU. So this sounds good, right? Opening up, liberalization, managed migration. But managed migration is always about selection, and selection means exclusion. And so who is excluded? The necessary complement, I'd argue, for selective managed migration policies is control over unselected, unwanted migration. So we're quite keen to create pathways for those who we select, but in return, we're quite keen to ratchet up coercive control against those who select us. And who are those people? Well, irregular, not undocumented so much, but irregular. Someone used a term yesterday that I wrote down in my notes, but I can't remember, but it amounts to the same thing. And that includes asylum seekers. So the right to asylum recognized in international law is steadily being eroded, not as a consequence of restrictionism on the far right only, although they play a role, and we'll talk about it later, but also among governments interested in being successful at managing migration. Yeah? So that's a similar trend, and we see this in some of the terrible policies that are being introduced and are subjecting asylum seekers to. This idea of refugee process status determination being done offshore, something borrowed from Australia, and now being touted as a way of dealing with irregular migrants to Great Britain via Rwanda. So liberalization for some categories of selected, wanted economic migrants, illiberal control against unselected, unwanted migrants whose claims for humanitarian assistance are reduced to queue jumping and all the other terms used by politicians. And the last point I want to say is that, yes, it has something to do with sovereignty, it has something to do with border control, but it has a lot to do with democracy. So these are the policies we, as voters, support, at least a majority of us. Politicians would not be so keen to restrict access to asylum seekers and other unselected migrants if it weren't for their promise to us to implement managed systems that they can control. So there's a theater around this, and the theater is animated by democracy, because as soon as an irregular flow of migrants happens upon a border, in any advanced industrialized democracy, the term that's used is crisis. And how do you deal with a crisis? With crisis measures.
Thanks. Do you want to jump in on this part of the conversation?
You just said it, I think, really, really well. I mean, I think the critical thing is to understand that immigration is an extremely varied phenomenon. That we're talking, you're mentioning labor and irregular, unwanted. We also look at student migration, which is also in Canada becoming a pathway to selection, actually, interestingly enough. And the point you're making about democracy, I think is critical, that this is about what you're really pointing at is what is our complicity. And it's interesting on this panel, just to out us all, I think we have 3 Europeans on this panel, or at least ties to Europe, very right? I still carry my Dutch passport. And yeah, this is part of what my government is doing. And if you're noticing what's going on with refugees in particular right now in the Netherlands, where they are absolutely mismanaging the flow of people. People are literally sleeping out on the street at migration centers. Now, this is not trivial. This is not, oh, it's not nice. This is actually a violation, I would argue, of refugee rights and human rights.
Yeah, I mean, Terry asks a broad question, which gives us the opportunity to sort of focus on what we think is important. And I think that I would turn our attention to the here and now. If you take a look at what's going on in Europe right this minute, we have asylum seeker numbers that are approaching 2015 numbers. I'm going to repeat that, 2015 numbers, which was of course then called a migrant crisis by politicians across the continent. What was the response? Ineptitude, right? They have a Dublin regulation that countries do not believe in, which requires that the state that is the first state of entry to be responsible for the immigrants. That is basically disrespected. Immigrants course through the south of Europe into the north, which wreaks havoc and chaos. Those governments are not prepared because there aren't policies designed to actually receive those immigrants. And then you have a cycle of backlash against those governments for their incompetence or their complicity in the arrival of those asylum seekers. Now in 2015 and 2016 and the period thereafter, there is a, you could say, generally generous response. Of course, Angela Merkel admitted 1 million asylum seekers at the time. Sweden actually admitted more per capita. There was a good amount of generosity from a number of northern and central European countries, but there was also immense backlash thereafter, right? So I don't think it's a surprise that after the 2015-2016 crisis, you saw the inflammation of far-right sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment, more restrictionist views, and the ushering in of new far-right governments into coalitions or into actually control of the premiership in a number of European countries, which is where we have ourselves today. Italy has far-right prime minister. Sweden is run by a government that has, within the largest plurality of seats, is held by the far-right party. The far-right controls the premiership across the Visegrad countries. This was a response in many ways to the incompetence of migration governance across the continent. We are due to see the same thing happen if there is not policy, if there is not good governance, if there is not order that's actually demonstrated. History is going to repeat itself.
Thanks so much.
Final word. I'm thinking back of, you asked us about the last 20 to 30 years, and I think the one thing that has really changed is Europe wants high-skilled immigrants. That's not something that you saw, over 20, 30, in the post-war era. That just wasn't there. And in that sense, Europe has become very similar to countries like Canada, just on a smaller scale. If you look at the EU Blue Card and the very favorable conditions that are linked to getting high-skilled work visas, being able to bring your family over. So I think, qualitatively speaking, that's the biggest change. I think the other things that have already been mentioned are more continuities. They go up and down, but there's always this undercurrent of those who we don't want, we try to keep out. And so, we now have, again, major seasonal worker programs, also through an EU directive. Again, no openness to family unification. They're strictly time limited. So it's just a repeat of the guest worker system, just better managed with the lessons of the guest worker system in mind to prevent settlement. So that's not that different, just more effective policy instruments. The same with family migration. That's, again, an unwanted category in most European countries, and a highly racialized debate about that. Again, that hasn't really changed so much, but the instruments are there now that did not exist in the 70s. And then asylum, I think my colleagues have already said everything that's important to bear in mind. But I just want to close, because you really prompted us to think about race in your keynote. And I think that intersection of race and class is really important. And yesterday we heard Jennifer Elric, her book talks about the making of middle-class multiculturalism, and she talks about that intersection of race and class in Canada. And I think that's also very potent in Europe, where to some extent, the class capital can offset the lack of race capital, if we use those terms from Bourdieu, which is the case with high-skilled workers. But where that is not there, where it's perceived not to be there, race is is very central. And you hear that in all debates on integration, on family immigration, on asylum, with, of course, Ukraine being a big exception. And I think we'll talk more about that in the course of the panel.
Great, thanks so much. So the second question I gave you is, how has the rise of far-right or radical right parties impacted the party landscape and positions taken by mainstream parties? And I did allude to that somewhat in my plenary, but I think it's interesting to think about that from your own research perspectives and how you see that playing out. So I'm going to start with Justin, because I know this is something he...
It's because I'm sitting on the far right.
Yes.
So the far right, which was once considered the fringe of Europe, of European politics, has become mainstream. There's no point in even calling them the fringe anymore, right? They take up 10% of almost every European parliament now, thanks to proportional representation that Terry alluded to during her keynote. And as I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, that they actually are in government and in some cases in the premiership of a number of countries today. They are in power, and what unites them is generally anti-immigrant sentiment. There actually is quite a bit of diversity across far-right parties. You have some far-right parties and far-right movements that are, quite neoliberal in their orientation, and it's kind of like what we saw in Britain. Davos upon Thames was the idea among a lot of the sort of far-right parties, movements inside of the Tory party and inside of the UKIP movement. But then you have also far-right leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary, that is incredibly socialist. He subsidizes. It's a politics of patronage and state welfare and state capitalism in many cases. So there actually is a lot of diversity in how they manage the country. But as it relates to immigration, this is the sine qua non of the far-right movement. What unites them all is generally Islamophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment, and it's been enough to drive them to power. And the problem is that the inept response to the asylum-seeking crisis and the inability to manage borders and control, as Terry used the word earlier, which is anathema to a lot of people on the far left, has constrained government's ability to actually manage migration policies that are strategic from a demographic change perspective, from an economic perspective. These are countries that are aging rapidly, faster than Canada, faster than the United States right now. They need workers at any level of skill, simply to actually sustain their national population. And yet their hands are tied from actually bringing in younger people, bringing in working age people, bringing in high and low skilled people to fill labor gaps, precisely because voters do not have the tolerance for becoming more open countries of migration. And they already believe they're open enough with the Free Mobility Pact. So the far right, in my research, actually has space to grow. I recently concluded a study of 19 European countries, representative samples across all of them, where the far right already has some seats in parliament. And what my co-authors and I find is that actually there are a number of people in Europe with attitudes that mirror those who currently vote for the far right, but continue to vote for center-right or center-left parties, establishment parties. In other words, they have not yet decided to defect from those establishment parties to go to the far right or far left yet. And yet, their attitude suggests that they very well could. And as the far right becomes mainstream, as I mentioned earlier, then you actually are going to see them become more palatable and less stigmatized as they may have been in the past. And so we cannot rely on the sort of taboo of the far right anymore. I think most European countries are now over that.
Yes. Go ahead, Anna. I see you shaking your head.
Oh, no, what I'm thinking about is, I'm going to shift a little bit from what you're saying, which I think is critically important. But one of the things I realized at some point, so I started studying what I thought was immigration in 2004. I'd been a welfare state scholar and I decided to move, but I was really interested in citizenship. So after the murder of Pim Fortuyn, I realized that if I wanted to study the formation of citizenship, the meaning of citizenship, I had to look at this immigration issue. I thought I was looking at immigration. And then I realized, no, what I'm looking at is really the politics of integration. Because a lot of these discourses, yes, they use these metaphors of being overrun, invaded, etc. But the people that they're talking about are long-term residents, and some of them citizens. And I think that that's part of the story that we miss a little bit, which is the story of the impact of these politics on actual people. And if I may tell a little story, can I tell a little story?
Please.
So this summer, I had the opportunity, finally, after 3 years of obeying COVID regulations, to travel back to Europe. And I'm working on a project on non-belonging, as I said. And I had the opportunity to interview Chidem Yüksel, who is a very successful Dutch photojournalist. And as you can tell from her name, probably, is Turkish background, but born and raised in the Netherlands. And I asked her at some point, are you Dutch? Do you feel Dutch? And she goes, you know what? I thought I wasn't. I planned my entire life growing up. My parents instilled in me a strong sense of Turkishness, and yeah, I grew up here, but I wanted to go back to Turkey. And in her early 20s, she went back to Turkey. And then after a couple of years there, she was like, I am so not Turkish. I am so Dutch. So that sounds like a beautiful integration story, right? She realizes that she's really Dutch. She goes back to the Netherlands, successful. Her work is bought by museums, etc. And she said to me, Anna, she's in her early 30s. Since 2005, when Geert Wilders was elected to parliament, I have been told that I don't belong here. And I can no longer have it in me to care. And I thought that was really, that speaks to something that I think we need to put on the table.
I mean, it's like when people are told, go back to your country.
Well, and this
right?
is the other part. So then there's another piece. So again, I'm in the Netherlands. It's 2022. What is it? The 20th anniversary of the death of Pim Fortuyn, right? The murder. So there's all these. So there is a podcast, and I read it, and I'm like, I got to listen to this, which I did. And the tagline of the podcast was, the ruling party is to the right of 2002 Pim Fortuyn. And if you look at Prime Minister Rutte's open letter to voters in 2017, the way he speaks about immigrants is appalling. They, them, if they don't like it here, they're making messes for us, they can leave. But he's talking about second, sometimes third generation people, right? So that's the bring it back to party politics, absolutely. And I think the Dutch is not, you can probably confirm that this is not an uncommon narrative strategy.
No, if anything, actually, not only do you see center-right parties being concerned that they'll be outflanked by the far right, you even see center-left parties. I mean, in Sweden is a really good example right now, and we may see this elsewhere as it becomes sort of consensus that immigration is out of control or what have you.
Well,
you might see other parties adapt as well, just like Rutte did.
Yeah, and in 2008, when Phil, you and I did some interviews, were these interviews we did together on integration? We both looked at those, right? Yes, sorry, it's been a long time. Jeroen Dijsselbloem of the Party of Labour, which at that point still was relevant, it's become irrelevant since, literally said to me, well, I can't be, in effect, he didn't say literally, in effect he said, I can't be too supportive of concerns around Islam and Muslims because the women in my party would object. So in that very brief statement, he captured these, one other really critical dimension that I would also want to put on the table, which is the way gender plays out in these politics. And this idea that the way he, in effect said, Islam stands for gender inequality, and it wasn't that he, as a member of the Party of Labour, should be against gender inequality. It was the women in his party for whom on whose behalf he should be against gender inequality, which showed actually how gender unequal Dutch politics are in general, right? And again, that's another dynamic that I think is really present in all of this. So now I'll stop.
I'm going to let Phil jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, agree with everything Justin said, and Anna as well, but you have to, I think, if we walked away with only those statements, I mean, you'd walk to your bathroom and slash your wrists and just call it a day. I think there's...
Speak for yourself.
There's a counterpoint. There's a counterpoint. What is Europe's premier immigration country? Germany. What coalition is in place now? A Green, Free Democrat, SPD coalition. What is their premier initiative on immigration? A point system that they've been talking about forever. We'll see if it happens. And, as I said earlier, if you froze me in 1998 and brought me back in 2022, I'd have a hard time recognizing the Christian Democrats, even some members of the Christian Social Union. I'd have an impossible time recognizing what happened to the SPD and the general rhetoric around immigration and diversity. Now, does that say that Germany's solved the issue, it's become Canada? No. And Anna, you said only a madman would study Canada and Germany. Well, that was my book. But I've been doing it for a while. And I think it's interesting to see how the two countries have converged in many ways. Canada has become a very, efficient guest worker country, just as Germany now is talking about managed migration using instruments borrowed from Canada and elsewhere. So I have to balance this. And on my question for Justin would be unmanaged, uncontrolled failure, but what exactly are you proposing to manage it? I mean, there's a sort of spectrum of acceptability in a liberal democracy, right? And we've already pushed at the limits of this. And at the same time, you mentioned, but there's need for labor. Yeah, of course. That means that employers are going to be pushing on governments of any orientation to open up increased pathways. We saw these European countries in the OECD with over a fifth, approaching even more, a quarter of their populations of foreign-born. Those aren't people who just, came as a consequence of mismanaged asylum policies. They're also there because they've been drawn there. So all to say, I agree somehow 100%, but would offer this complementary position to say it's a little more complicated than that.
No, these are the countervailing trends coming together. You have immense amounts of pressure on labor markets and fiscal balances, right? The pension systems are enormous in Europe, and you need people paying in. At the same time, you have an unwillingness to actually diversify and an unwillingness to actually let more people in. And what it's going to produce is likely, I think, Europe's slightly different because you have the Free Mobility Pact, and so you have this sort of fresh flow of labor coming from mostly Eastern and Southern Europe into Western and Northern Europe. But to the extent that they actually need some kind of skill to fill the skill gap, is you're probably going to see what my co-author Anna Boucher and I have written about called the market model, which is where countries are going to opt for a lot more temporary labor migration in the future in order to sell desperately needed immigration to skeptical publics. The assurances that these governments are giving, and you see this now in Japan, you see this in Canada actually as well, there's a lot of temporary labor migration here, and the justification is simple. Don't worry, they're not staying long. It's the Uberization of immigration policy. It's a gig economy, use and remove. And this very transactional and I think instrumental approach to immigration is what we're seeing spreading now. And I don't think Europe is going to be immune to it because it's the only way to sell it to publics. But I'll warn everyone, before we think that the market model is this brilliant political compromise to facilitate inbound migration, the concern is that when you are assuring your people that immigrants will not stay long, the immigrants do not invest in their integration into the country because they know they're not going to be there very long, or they're subject to visa renewals, which means they may not integrate as well, which of course fuels sentiment that they're not integrating well enough. It also tells the public, don't invest in relationships with immigrants because they're not staying long, and so there's little scope for mutual understanding. And it usually does not allow immigrants to innovate, to create new businesses, to file patents, which is one of the sort of secret recipes of countries like Canada and the United States and Australia, which have very strong permanent residency systems. Immigrants are the secret sauce of our economies. And the European economies will not benefit from that if there is not an assurance of permanence. And so I think that Phil is spot on by saying something's got to give. And unfortunately, I think that the remedy that's on the table right now is not one that's actually going to be something that's overwhelmingly positive.
Did you want to add to this?
So I'm kind of going back to where you started off in your question, trying to figure out where do I position myself within the discussion so far. And I think I'm somewhere maybe in the middle, but leaning more toward the pessimists here. I think structural factors obviously are very powerful, and they are hard to get around. And if we look at what facilitated the rise of the far right in Europe, it's a fragmentation of the party system where the center gets hollowed out, where center-right, center-left parties are really no longer able to attract the votes and opening up spaces to the left and the right. And then you have new issues on the agenda like immigration, and hence you have far-right parties. And so overall, I would say in the vast majority of European countries, you've really seen a mainstreaming of the far right in the mainstream parties as well, agendas on the center left and the center right have moved to the right on immigration and integration, continually so, at the same time as the far right parties have moved even further to the right over time. That's not true in all countries, like Italy and Portugal, I think are, Ireland and Portugal are important exceptions. And so there's some variation, but the pattern overall, I think, is really a right shift that has been driven by authoritarian values, cultural, social values, in particular immigration. So that's structural in many ways, and that's not offset by a strong ethnic minority voting bloc, as is the case in Canada. Also, in part, a function of electoral systems. Phil has done some excellent work on that. It's a smaller electorate, doesn't have the same electoral clout. So there is not that countervailing mechanism where politicians don't want to alienate immigrant communities. They can get away with that and still win elections. I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. Now, Phil is right. When you go to Europe today, it looks different from when I grew up in terms of, it's more diverse in terms of also people in positions of power. But I'm asking myself, who are the people who I see? And I think this is where the integration debates are so powerful, because who can succeed through the system, I think for the most part, are people who are happy to, particular people who are secular, who can move through the system. Much harder if you are observant religious, not Christian. And I think that is one of the big, especially talking about Germany, which is the country I really know the best, where I grew up and keep returning to, is this a perception of Christianity as this is just our culture and our values. And hence, it's not problematic in any way in a pluralistically religious society with different religions present. And I'm speaking from experience. Even my daughter is Jewish. 5 years ago, she went to a local public elementary school in Berlin, and the struggles we had in explaining to people, no, we don't want her in religious education, no, we don't want her to be part of that Christmas event and that Christmas event, but it's just culture. I think that is a discussion that's really hasn't happened, and I would have thought would have happened at this point in European societies, an understanding of how a society is shaped by religion in ways that is not just cultural in a benign way, but it excludes others. So I think unless I'm telling this anecdote because it connects to my observation that most successful ethnic minority folks have been secular in German politics in particular. So I think there's a lot has to happen for there to be more grounds for optimism.
Thanks for that. So I'm going to add a little bit to the next question because some of the things you guys have raised, but given that there have been several waves of refugees entering Europe, what are the economic and social impacts of increases in immigrant populations? What difference have been seen with Ukrainian refugees versus those from the Middle East and Africa? And I would add to that, you guys raised the issue of temporary migration schemes. It seems like this flow of refugees could also have an impact on those ideas around temporary migration schemes. And let's see, Antje, do you mind starting this one?
No, it's fine. I'll start with the Ukraine, what to do with what's happening with the Ukraine. And I think, that's been true in many countries, but in Europe in particular, I think the fact that for the first time the European Union actually activated this directive that has been on the book, I think, since 2001, if I'm not mistaken, the Temporary Protection Directive, which basically gives Ukrainians legal status right away as they arrive, which means they have a work permit, they have access to social services, they have access to benefits. This is the first time that, as the EU has ever handled a group of humanitarian migrants in that way. And that's a stark contrast, of course, to Syrians, Afghan refugees, Iraqi refugees, the 2015, 2016. And we've had, I think now we're at the point where 4 million people have received protection under that directive. And we see a really big difference in terms of labor market participation, which is really not surprising, but it's important to point that out. We've got pretty high employment rates among Ukrainians, even though they're predominantly female, often with children, right? So a hard to employ population, to use that language. So we've people working much faster, much higher proportion than when we look at when the Syrians in particular arrived. Again, people point to, oh, but Ukrainians are more highly educated. Well, if you look at the jobs that the Ukrainians are actually taking, they're not highly educated jobs. They're just trying to make some money, meant to be temporary. Let's save up some money that we can send home or can return home with. So that's not really a very compelling argument to me. There are some factors that are different, more networks in Europe through pre-existing migration, so communities diasporas are stronger than was the case with Syrians overall. But I think the big difference is really the difference in legal response. And that has been going hand in hand with a real outpouring of public support, even in countries that did not have that in 2015-16, in particular the Eastern European countries, where employers are going out of their way, creating new jobs, just with Ukrainian refugees in mind. But even France, who was not very welcoming of Syrians, is employing Ukrainian assistant teachers in schools to support Ukrainian kids in schools. So there is kind of a very strong civil society mobilization. Employers are much more proactive. I think Germany may be a little bit more complicated in that comparison, but overall employers are much more proactive. And certainly the legal situation, the legal response has been so different that it's really hard not to, it's not that sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. This is the very first time, the only time this has happened, and this is, at least since this directive was in place, the only wide humanitarian flow into Europe. I think it's hard not to make a connection between that.
Justin, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it is indubitable that the ethnic similarities between Ukrainians and the rest of Europe is a factor here, and it's unmentioned often, but it's just so bleedingly obvious that we have to acknowledge it. But I think there's also something else that's going on here too, because you must be asking yourself, why be so receptive to Ukrainians and be so unreceptive or reactionary in so many cases to Syrians or Afghans who are in the same situation in many cases, right? And I think that the answer is nationalism. And let me explain myself. When looking at Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers coming over, the national government has framed their arrival as people who are fleeing an existential threat to the European continent, and that aiding these refugees, you are actually doing something incredibly patriotic because you are helping people who are fleeing an existential threat, an existential enemy, which is, of course, Vladimir Putin, right? That is not the understanding that people take towards Afghans, despite the fact that they're fleeing the Taliban. That is not the way that people frame Syrians, despite the fact that they are fleeing Assad, who also, by the way, is fueled and bankrolled by Putin, right? So it is simply a mindset difference as well that's going on here. I'm going to bring you back to the North American continent for a second. The United States was incredibly welcoming towards Afghan refugees during the Afghan airlift. What was the way these people were framed? Patriots. These were people who helped the American military and helped American diplomatic personnel for years in a war zone, sacrificing their lives, their families, their livelihoods in the name of the American mission in Afghanistan. That is a totally different way from the way most Americans have previously thought of refugees coming from Venezuela, or the non-refugee forced migrants who come from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, right? And so to me, a critical lesson that I think everyone can take away from the Ukrainian refugee situation is framing, is how do we understand, how do we tell stories about humanitarian immigrants? And we allowed the story about Afghans and Syrians to be hijacked and to not tell the story that, in fact, they are fleeing the forces of illiberalism that threaten the European continent.
Yeah. And if I may add, I think there's also the frame of temporariness that plays a role. Because my sense is that the idea of the Ukrainians is that they want to go back. And they actually are also, just anecdotally, in talking to Janine, who's very sad she can't be here, about Switzerland, they actually move back and forth, which is usually not allowed for refugees, but they move back and forth to Ukraine to check on things and then come back to Switzerland, say. So this idea, I think there's almost a frame, there's a dual there, I think. One is temporariness, and the other is that kind of, even if not, who knows if it ever will happen that Ukraine becomes part of the EU, Ukraine has sort of been inscribed now as part of Europe very firmly, exactly like you say. So I think those two things.
I mean, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. I'd only say one thing in addition, that's that the experience of the Syrian refugees has told us something about tipping points. So one of our colleagues at Oxford, Matthew Gibney, famously pointed out that a humanitarian response to asylum flows is as generous as it can be until the society tips into disorder or some kind of socio-economic chaos. Germany admitted 1.2 million people in the span of less than 4 or 5 months. It barely caused a ripple, socially, economically. Politically, though, and here with your opening point, I'm in total agreement, it had a massive political consequence that forced the sitting government to reverse itself within the space of weeks, right? After the Cologne incident on New Year's Eve and after some other incidents in Germany and pressure arising from the breakthrough of the Alternative for Germany party, Angela Merkel was forced to enter into a very dubious deal with Turkey and also do different things to improve deportation or make it more efficient and otherwise close access to asylum seekers, to go back to the status quo before September 2015. So the political tipping point is what's of most interest, right? The social and economic tipping points must be much greater. I mean, you think, how many people would it take? And there we have some historical precedents, right? Greece, a country of less than 4 million people, accepted 1.5 million refugees in the space of weeks after a exchange of populations with Turkey, the newly founded Republic of Turkey. We have the German experience after World War II. So I think what's clear is rich industrialized countries have capacity to accept many, many more humanitarian migrants than they presently do without any consequence socially or economically. And there may be benefits economically, as we're seeing in Germany and Sweden and elsewhere.
And the political tipping point, if in case you're wondering, it's not a matter of quantity of immigrants, according to a variety of political science research on this. I think most notably by Ben Newman from UC Riverside, who finds that it's really about the pace of change, not the scale. It's when people sense that the pace is moving too fast. And in many ways, this has been a sort of secret, sauce of Canada, I think, in the sort of gradual nature of immigration scale, and also the United States to some degree. When the pace feels too fast is when people sort of try to hit the brakes.
Good point. So we've mentioned the EU in the context of Ukraine. So I'm wondering, what is the role is the EU playing in immigration policy these days, and how have border countries like Italy, Hungary, and Poland impacted the positions taken by the EU? And who wants to jump in first? I'll take a...
I'm happy to go.
Sure.
Maybe I'll start with Eastern Europe and then leave you guys to Southern Europe. I think the two most important, obviously, right, these are relatively new member states, accession in the 2000s, and I think two of the most important impacts of joining the European Union has been one step back, when the accession negotiations focused very prominently on immigration, because the timing of accession was such that there was already the EU had entered that as a policy-making sphere. And so when the Eastern European countries joined the European Union, there were two broad requirements on the immigration front. One was a common visa regime, and the other was border controls, stricter border controls. And they were really important for the region because prior to that, there was much more regional integration and also cross-border flow of labor. And so having to join the common visa regime with the EU common visa regime meant that basically all the surrounding countries to the east had visa impositions imposed on them, really disrupting neighborly relations and also flow of people back and forth. So that's one important impact of the EU. The other is border controls, stepping up deportations, all the usual catalog of measures that most of us are familiar with. And so, we're looking at, it's interesting, it was very interesting to me to look at Poland in particular with, in 2015, 2016, the kind of Poland and other Eastern European countries really blocking any redistribution of refugees, taking a really hard line and thinking in the back of my head how much of that is a doing of the EU itself. Because when these countries joined, it was very different, and Poland had for long prided itself on a refugee welcoming tradition, kind of part of the identity. That there is very little of that left. Some of that is resurrected now with Ukraine, and that's again because of these special relationships these countries have had for historically, and we can talk about race again. But I think the impact of joining the EU on immigration has been a real hardening on policies, a focus on restrictions, something that now has been really naturalized in political discourse and in policies, and I'll leave it at that.
Let's just go this way. So Phil, you want to go next?
I would just say that the EU's been really fundamental in shaping this illiberal-liberal dialectic, in some ways enabling migration initially, and most importantly for creating freedom of movement for European citizens, and then by extension people who enter Europe who are not citizens. And at the same time, in order to manage that, as it were, really intensifying control of borders, as Antje pointed out. So these things are happening at the same time, and now a professor in Anna Triantafylidou's amazing institute at TMU, Craig Damian Smith, this was the essence of his dissertation at the U of T, at the University of Toronto, that these two things had to happen together. You had to have opening on the one hand internally with intensification of control externally. The only other thing I'd say is not so much for Eastern Europe, but the country I know a little bit about and I'm attached to otherwise, Greece, which quite deservedly gets hammered by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, etc., but is doing, when it was doing its job, this was the way Dublin was supposed to work. And what it created was camps that were overrun with desperate people. And so the chaos comes when a country says, listen, this isn't working, we're going to wave these people through into Europe. And yes, that is a sign of breakdown of control, but that was a terrible system to begin with. It was bound to fail, and legal scholars were pointing this out then. And the real crazy point is that we want to go back to the EU seems to think they can re-implement this, right? And the Poles were just doing their job. It was Angela Merkel who said, actually, we're not going to abide by the rules of Dublin. We're not going to send people back. We're going to accept them, as it were, as did Sweden. So it's really remarkable. And again, I agree very much with Justin that this is a problem, and it hasn't been addressed. And given that forced migration isn't going to dissipate, it's going to be a persistent problem.
I'm trying to think if I have anything to add to this. I'm thinking about Frontex. Right? And I'm sitting here sort of really wanting to ask a question of my political science colleagues, because the idea that Frontex and basically the failure to manage migration across the Mediterranean, within still high levels of death at sea, continuing accusations of pushbacks, et cetera, of not actually following, by claiming that people who are trying to move from North Africa into the EU, so Italy, are not refugees, so we don't have to treat them as having a right to make a refugee claim. And I hear people use the language of a failure. But is this actually a failure? If you've been doing something that isn't working and that is causing death for 15 years, is that a failure or is that a willful action? Right? Yeah.
Just a point to Southern Europe, because the language of managing migration is so prominent. It's very prominent in Canada. It's very prominent at the EU level, and it's seen as something positive, restoring order into what before was chaos. But there are many things in which it really tries to do something it's not well equipped to do, and maybe worse than the status quo. And I'm thinking of, before 2004 with the European Pact on Asylum and Migration. If you look at Italy, if you look at Spain, if you look at Greece, these are economies with really big informal sectors, right? And loosely regulated labor flow from abroad. And the way that these countries dealt with people who stayed is through, regularization programs. People became permanent residents and later citizens. And under pressure from the European Union to manage all of that, these large-scale regularization programs were abandoned in all three countries. Instead, countries set up kind of labor recruitment programs, but there are still permits to run out, and we still have a big issue of undocumented immigration, but we no longer have these policy tools that were very pragmatic to allow people to belong in a meaningful way by having legal status. So the EU hasn't come up with anything to take that place. I think there's a big gap under that, the good sounding word of managing and all, but I think there needs to be more attention paid to do these policies really improve over what was there before, and maybe sometimes a more ad hoc response is better than trying to manage it all.
I mean, the ad hoc response is basically what we've got right now, right? It's the whole system depends on an ad hoc response, and I think that if these numbers continue to climb, to 2015 levels, it's going to rely on, I guess, governments' ad hoc responses to do something. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, governments are going to look back and say, Western European and Northern European governments are going to look back and say, well, my predecessors were generous. My predecessors, ad hoc response got them ushered out of office. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not sure, I think we all know that ad hoc responses aren't going to do it. What's remarkable is that there is an appetite for the revision or the renovation of the Dublin regulations, which basically are not in place effectively, but they will be blocked by Austria, Hungary, and Poland. But what's really marvelous, actually, about all this is that a lot of these Eastern European states are precisely the states that are subject to really severe brain drain of their own populations. Mm-hmm. And what's happening is twofold in these countries. One is that you are losing the population that is actually going to then, that is usually younger and working age, moving to Western and Northern Europe, which then intensifies these fiscal imbalances, deepens their reliance on the EU for subsidies, and creates even greater demographic economic problems. But secondly, it also in many ways reinforces the status of far-right and more populist parties, because the people who leave are disproportionately those who would not otherwise support them. And so this is creating a number of selection effects that that's not sustainable, basically, because you're going to keep populists in power on the one hand, but the problems that that put them in power are not actually going to get resolved.
Yeah, I think it raises an interesting point of, we haven't mentioned the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis and the impact that had on flows from Southern and Eastern Europe into Western and Northern Europe. So I think that's a really important point that we can look at. I'm going to kind of gloss over one of the questions I had around racism and white nationalism and kind of veer more into the issue of immigration and settlement policy and what can Europe really learn from Canada and the U.S. and vice versa. And especially if you look at the U.S. right now with the rise of white nationalism and so on. I mean, unfortunately, some of the learning is negative. So, I think I was trying to address that from the positive side, but I think there's also negative learning, at least from the perspective of those who want, equality and so on. Oops, I knew I was going to do that. And so, I think it's important to think about, not just, okay, what can we learn from Canada and the U.S. from a positive perspective, but what are some of the negative policy outcomes that are impact, as well as negative politics. And I'm going to start again with, and we'll come this way, because Justin has been looking at these questions quite a bit.
Oh, but there's just too many lessons to learn from each other. When I first started studying the politics of immigration and demographic change a little over a decade ago, really, there was an understanding that European politics experts, like those of my esteemed colleagues on the panel, stay in their lane and focus on Europe, and North American experts who focus on Canada or the United States, they stay in their lane. Those lanes are dissolved. Our politics have converged in ways that you are actually at a loss. You're going to miss something if you do not study North American politics in the context of the politics of Europe. And I think that diplomats and heads of state have always known this. They are always looking over their shoulder at what their colleagues across the pond are doing. But now scholars are too. And it's really enriching the field, I think, in meaningful ways. The basic, to narrow everything down into a sort of nutshell, North American countries do a better job in terms of their approach to integration, their civic nationalism, their understanding of citizenship and political incorporation, and I know that the really impressive panel that's going to be following us will surely talk about this, and probably the way it's under threat now. And Europeans can learn a lot from, I think, the North American models of political incorporation and integration. But I also think that, looking over at Europe, the Free Mobility Pact is something that has been such an enormous virtue, I think, for Europe, and has in many ways allowed European countries to postpone their demographic problems, at least in the West and North. And so I think that there's already a lot of policy diffusion. What we've really seen, I think, is you were going to gloss over the question of white nationalism, but it's unignorable, is the way that the continents have mutually reinforced each other as it relates to white nationalism and the way it inspires far-right movements. In many ways, Europe came first, and Terry, your research was really ahead of everyone's in noticing the way that electoral institutions in Europe facilitated the arrival and the expansion of far-right movements there. But Donald Trump took the baton from Europe and basically said, I'll one-up you. And the Europeans learned from that too. And so it's not just policy diffusion that's taking place, it's politics diffusion that's taking place. And neither continent really has a clear strategy, I think, for how to diffuse it. Perhaps the Canucks do. And I will add to the chorus of people saying that Canadians are fundamentally different. Not the people, the country, surrounded by 3 oceans and the richest country on earth. It's just different, and it facilitates a sense of control that sort of lubricates the governance using multiculturalism. It's just a structural advantage that pretty much no one else has. Australia maybe, because they're literally surrounded by 4 oceans, or at least 4 sides of seas. So, I think that we just don't have a path through these politics of how to navigate it. But I do think that we're seeing the beginnings of strategies emerge, and it relates back to what I said about the Afghan airlift and Ukrainians. If you can turn people's understanding of immigration into not a matter of charity, not a matter of humanitarianism, and not a matter of economic transaction and instrumentalism, but into a matter of national interest, you are taking nationalism from the far right and leveraging it for liberal purposes and progressive purposes. But people left of center and on the left are loath to do this. They find nationalism vile. They find it foul. And in many cases, it is. But it doesn't have to be. And I think that's the number one lesson to take away, is that when the left has been able, or just centrist liberals, have been able to navigate these politics, it's because they do not allow the far right to monopolize the understanding of the national interest and create this understanding of the nation as something monolithic and unchanging.
Oh, we go this way, and Anna?
God, I want to clap for that. I'm sitting here thinking about Quebec and thinking about Canada in particular as not one unitary space, but being that we are Montreal. And again, I'll do the negative thing, and then Phil, maybe you can follow up with a positive. We'll see. Because I do think that we want to. I want to think a little bit. I absolutely agree with your assessment of nationalism as something that we could. Maybe we don't call it that. Maybe we just say doing the right thing. I don't know. That could, in the Canadian context, work. And actually, when I moved to Canada as an immigrant in 2004, I was struck by that very thing. The 3 months into living here, an American broadcaster passed away, and my partner and I are reading the newspapers, and he says, oh, guess what they say? And I said, Canadian-born American broadcaster? Because I'd picked up on that claiming of famous people, on that Canadian pride. Having said that, when I look at Quebec, particularly the Bill 21. And then I've done work on the similarities between French headscarf politics and Quebecois politics in that area. I see policy transference in a direction that I think is illiberal. And when I look at the fact that we did now have an ultra-right party on the ballot in the last election, I do think there are things. I don't want to say, oh my God, it's going to, we're at the abyss. But I do think that I see diffusion of a European far-right nationalism into the Canadian sphere. And we're probably at a point right now where that can still be transformed. But I think it's something that we absolutely need to pay attention to.
Anna, I think, and we're drifting into the Canadian panel, which is unfortunately passé, but I think we might as well. We know that the far right relies on the perception of things being out of control, and we know that the far right relies on on nostalgia. We know there's extensive research on this, right? If we know these things, where does the nostalgia come from in Canada? And maybe that's an easier question, but where does the sense of things being out of control come from in Canada? And that's what I don't know, because the great thing about the Canadian system is that it conveys order and it conveys acting in the national interest.
Let's hope it's enough.
Yeah. I think we can pass it on to Bill.
Well, I mean, quite simply, any evidence of unmanaged migration is taken as something, deeply wrong with the way things work. So it only takes a few tens of thousands of people crossing from New York State into Quebec for politicians at the federal level as well as the provincial levels to begin to rub their hands and worry. And we forget that the Trudeau Liberal government passed an amendment to asylum policy in an omnibus budget bill that they used to complain that the Harper Conservatives used omnibus bills to do all sorts of nefarious things, and there they did a nefarious thing, making it much harder for asylum seekers crossing over from Roxham Road and elsewhere to make an asylum claim successfully. So you quite rightly noted it's not the numbers, it's the perception. And in some ways, having this well-calibrated managed migration system, which is kind of a theater system, right? Because we're talking about human beings who are going to use whatever ingenuity they have to get around these things. When that Wizard of Oz sort of thing, you pull back the clock and say, wow, people are using their agency and crossing into Canada and taking advantage of a loophole in a safe third country agreement, which is a product of policy diffusion, right? A bad policy diffusion thing. Well, then it's a crisis. Mm-hmm. We don't need 50,000 people running through Munich per day. We just need a few hundred, and that's our crisis. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, two things, very simply. I think European countries should stop talking about integration so much and use the term settlement. Mm-hmm. I think that's a great term in Canada, settlement assistance. Not integrating into a society, that's hard and kind of crazy when you think about it, right? for a newcomer to somehow pass as a local.
And I have to take this opportunity to mention our somebody who was influential to both of us was Aristide Zolberg's ideas
Absolutely.
around, the various types of, integration, if you want to call it that.
Different kinds of boundaries, right? So a space for boundary blurring, I think his normative point was, this is great. States shouldn't be involved in all this. I remember once he came back from an event where a really smart Harvard student was making a strong argument in favor of multiculturalism. He wouldn't stop talking about it. He'd say, yeah, it was really good, but the market does a lot of this too, In the United States, he'd point out Jennifer Lopez on the cover of a magazine that only Latinas bought. And I think I've come to recognize there's something to this, that if you leave space, then a lot of this will happen over time. But what newcomers need is settlement assistance. Finding language courses, finding employment, finding housing, etc. And Canada has done this well for a very long time. And that's something I wish would be picked up. And it is being picked up in Germany, at least. I'm less clear on other places. The second thing is stop giving interior ministries responsibility over immigration and set up immigration ministries.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd leave it at that.
That's been something that's, we've talked a lot about within the field of, well, not just political science, but this idea that we need ministries that are actually focused on this. In the U.S., they sort of did this after 9/11. They tried to, kind of separate the customer service side of immigration from the, border patrol and border control side of it. So I think that's because of course if it's in the Ministry of the Interior, the focus is border control, whereas there's all kinds of other elements that have to be taken into consideration. But,
Okay, really want to echo your points, though I'm hesitant to use the word settlement in an uncritical way, given how integral it is to settler colonialism. I think we need to think about that. So I just want to point that out. I think for me, what Canada can contribute, it's a very simple point. I think the kind of elite discourse that immigration is a benefit. There are exceptions, but overall, there are many references to the economic, cultural, social, economic benefits of immigration, and that's a cross-party consensus. I think that's extremely powerful in terms of creating a space for doing good work on immigration. I think that is absent or much weaker in Europe. And I think this course is very powerful because it provides the overall frame within then problems and solutions get discussed. Obviously, that's not the kind of suggestion that just can be easily implemented. I realize that. Lessons from the US, I think there's a lot to learn at the municipal level, especially when it comes to undocumented immigrants. So like sanctuary cities, it's something that European cities are just beginning now to explore, finding ways of supporting undocumented immigrants in terms of providing services, facilitating a more secure status. I think their cities can learn a lot from looking at the US sanctuary cities. Lessons from Germany, again, the country I'm most familiar with, and I want to kind of go back to our first keynote with Ratna Omdivar, who talked about credential recognition, which is such a big issue in Canada. It always comes back to credential recognition, and Germany has really done a lot of work on that in a really pragmatic way that I think Canada would do well to look at, and I'm just going to mention a few examples. The Skilled Immigration Act, which was passed in 2020, basically facilitated credential recognition from abroad by connecting would-be immigrants with employers, establishing the contact, identifying places of employment, helping them collect all the necessary documents they need, very hands-on support. Then the IQ network, the Integration Through Qualification Network, which is kind of this big flagship coordination mechanism. All the 16 Länder are involved in that. It's a multi-sectoral initiative that has created, at this point, over 70 counseling centers in Germany there to support immigrants who are struggling with credential recognition, and also working within German job centers for intercultural training and raising or creating knowledge about credential systems in sending countries. So that's really, really important. Even looking at the vocational sectors, the chambers of industry and trade have done a lot in that. to make sure there's more consistent practices across the countries. There are now sub-chambers that specialize at particular countries of origin to really understand the education and credentialization system there, and then figure out where does it have to be adjusted to be applied to Germany. So there are really a lot of initiatives that Germany has the benefit that federalism is not as strong as in Canada, so you don't have, medical doctors can practice across Germany. That's a big difference, so there's a limit to that. There's also the case that, and Terry, you mentioned this before, Germany's neo-corporatism, which has this long tradition of business and labor working together. And I think this is a great example where groups are coming together to just very pragmatically find a solution to a problem.
Great. So I'm going to ask you guys to be very quick on this last question, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions from the audience. Does Canada have a responsibility to help Europe with migration flows, particularly in the current context of flows coming from Ukraine, Africa, the Middle East, and so on? So this will be kind of a flash round. So I'm going to start with Anna, because I don't think I've started with you on.
I just wrote down yes.
Okay, but what does that look like? Very quick.
I mean, you know what? When there's something about the question that I struggle with a little bit with, because the notion of responsibility with Europe, I would want to zoom out and say, what is our responsibility? Why are we framing the responsibility at the point that people are leaving certain places? How do we come, and I know this is like, I get to be a sociologist, so I don't have to really deal with politics in the same way as the rest of you. But I'm thinking, Didier Bigot, a French migration scholar, at a conference in 2014, gave this talk where he said, when we think of Fortress Europe, we put, and it's the Frontex story in a way. We put this very strong boundary and border around Europe, and then everything that happens outside Europe, like either impacts Europe or doesn't impact Europe. But we never talk about how what Europe does creates and interacts with the politics of the places that migration flows from. Right? So I'm thinking, like when we say, does Canada have a responsibility to help Europe with migration flows from Africa, Middle East, and Ukraine? Sure, we seem to do fairly well at bringing people in. I do want to put the issue of waiting for papers and waiting for stuff on the table, because I do think that that's actually a huge barrier at an individual level to people actually being able to settle or and yes, we are a settler colony, so migration is always continuing the settler colonization of Canada, and that's something to also think about. But I would want to ask, in a way, do we... when we think about migration flows, what are causing those? And how do we interface with those causes? And what do we do there, rather than always working at the point of being reactive? Yeah.
Justin?
As the only non-Canadian on the panel, I'll pass on the normative statements about what Canada should do. But it seems like Canadians are already inclined to help, and I'll let my other panelists answer.
Antje, and then Phil.
Okay. So I don't think Canada has the obligation to help Europe. I think Europe has enough resources to deal with that. They're just lacking political will. I think Canada has the obligation to support Lebanon, Turkey, Bangladesh, any global South receiving countries. I think that's where it comes in. I think Europe has enough resources to deal with it.
Exactly what Antje said, and if Canada wants to do more to assist regions in need, why not a resettlement program for Rohingya? Why not do more for Venezuelans, other South and Central Americans? And insofar as Europe needing help, maybe the data's, I didn't check multiple sources, but France is a pretty big country, important European country, accepted 10,000 refugees in 2019. That is scandalous. That's a scandal. Now, they might say that we spend much more in situ in helping regions and countries that are shouldering the greatest part of the burden, but surely you can do more than that. So I don't think Canada needs to help European countries in managing migration because they're relatively rich. but Canada could do much, much more, as Ratna pointed out, to earn the reputation it presently has as a leader on humanitarian migration.